Dinosaur, written by Stephen Llewelyn and performed by Chris Barrie. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell to keep up to date with the latest installments.
Chapter 6. The Dinosaur Kid. Dr. Thomas Wood whistled softly. They're really that big? Hang on a second. He waved a hand over his desk, causing a keyboard to light up within the glass top. After typing a short prompt, the large monitor built into the laminated glass wall of the office also lit up and began searching for Tim's comm. Within seconds, the devices synced, and the dinosaur suddenly filled much of the wall. Thomas moved closer to study the detail.
"Ah, that's better," said Tim. "Actually, there may have been much bigger animals than we know. The examples you see here are reconstructed from semi-complete fossil remains, representing some of the largest sauropod dinosaurs known to have lived in South America during the late Albian stage of the mid-Cretaceous. Some titanosaurs, Argentinosaurus for example, could have grown up to 40 meters in length with an estimated weight of 80 tons in life, possibly more. They could have stood easily 9 or even 10 meters tall at the hip too. Interestingly enough, or should I say worryingly enough, the largest and most complete individual found so far was not even a full adult, so who knows how big they could get? Scientists have been unable to agree on that one. I suppose we'll find out soon enough though, eh?
A comforting thought. I assume by the comparative smallness of the head and the lumbering posture that these were herbivores? Asked Thomas.
Correct, Tim replied. But there are hints in the fossil record of similar animals much larger even than these. For example, Amphicoelius phragmileus. Only a single vertebra of that animal was ever found, but its vertebra was 2.7 meters tall.
Despite his workload, Thomas was fascinated. And how does that compare with our friend Argentinosaurus here?
The comparable vertebra belonging to Argentinosaurus was about 1.5 meters tall, Tim supplied with obvious relish. Yes, he continued, noting their expressions and nodding slightly. Amphicoelius scales up to an animal some 60 meters in length and is what's known as a megasauropod. Although this animal was probably of lighter build proportionally than Argentinosaurus, the sheer size of the animal would have probably weighed in at well over 100 tons.
Were they of the same family or genus, is it? Asked Woodsy.
Not exactly, answered Tim. Although they were both part of the generic sauropod family of dinosaurs, you know, the long-neck, long-tailed types, Argentinosaurus was a titanosaur, as I said. They were massively built eating machines, able to pick from the treetops 15 or even 20 meters up, all the way down to the ground, left and right, and swallow any vegetation they came across whole. And they ate a lot. It's believed that most sauropods let the bacteria in their guts break down the tough plant fibers during the digestive process so they could shovel it in at a prodigious rate, without the need to waste time chewing. It's likely they even swallowed stones to act in tandem with their enormous stomach muscles, like a grinding mill for tough plant stems, etc. Back to your question. The Amphicoelius phragmileus is believed to be of the Diplodocid family, like the much more famous Diplodocus. Although spectacularly huge animals, they were lighter in frame than the titanosaurs. A Diplodocus of similar or even greater length than the Argentinosaurus would probably weigh no more than 20 tons. As luck would have it, one of the ways in which sauropod dinosaurs can be identified is via their vertebrae. This single piece of evidence is far from the whole story, but it does at least make some kind of basic comparable supposition possible.
20 tons? Is that all? Mocked Woodsy. So are we going to see any diet dippies out there?
Diplodocids, or their progeny possibly, but not Diplodocus. As far as we know, they've been extinct since the end of the Jurassic period. That's about 40-odd million years ago before when we find ourselves now. The Jurassic period ended about 145 million years ago in our own timeline, Tim added for clarification.
I would say I'm reasonably qualified as a mathematician, began Thomas modestly.
I'll say,
Woodsy butted in, You've got so many letters after your name, it has the consonant consistency of a Welsh shopping list. But the numbers you're reeling off are quite extraordinary. The mathematics involved in calculating how they carried their weight and how they moved must be completely engrossing. The forces at work. Thomas ran out of words, shaking his head ruefully. Mother Nature, the greatest engineer of all, he said at last. This would be incredibly intriguing if we weren't stuck here and about to start living next door to these awesome creatures. Tim frowned, staring at Woodsy. How do you know what Welsh looks like, shopping list or otherwise? He asked. The evening we left Earth, I went to the gym to try it out, and Private Jones was in there. I asked him how he got so big, and he showed me the workout charts he'd drawn up. It was Woodsy's turn to frown. They didn't look like words, but Dowie assured me they were. Oh, I'm more surprised by consonant consistency, remarked Thomas dryly. I thought you were expecting to flunk English. Or is it simply that Mr. Norris here is having a positive effect on you? He turned back to Tim, smirking at his son's look of annoyance. OK, you've shown me the biggest. Now show me the baddest. Somehow I've got to remake these trucks and diggers so that their cabs at least can take a smack from these guys. Tim bent over the computer to call up adult Giganotosaurus carolini, Maposaurus rosei, and Irritator chalengeri. In the late Albian, early Cenomanian stages of the Middle Cretaceous, Tim began, the supercontinent of Pangaea, which literally means entire Earth and included most of the world's landmass during the early Mesozoic era, was well on the way to dividing into the continents we're familiar with. The world in front of us still looks quite different from the one we've left behind, but there are recognizable features beginning to emerge, like the Atlantic Ocean, for instance, although ocean may be too grand a title for the sea that exists in this period. Very simply, Pangaea split into Gondwana in the south and Laurasia in the north throughout the Jurassic period. The Gondwana, where Lieutenant Singh wants to land, is made up of what will be South America, Africa, Antarctica, India, and Australia. Subsequently, Laurasia is where we'll find what will be North America, Europe, and Asia one day, excluding India, naturally. We believe that by the Middle Cretaceous, Gondwana too was split or splitting up, leaving South America disconnected. This means that the animals there share common ancestry with other creatures, but have been alone long enough to begin evolving separately. However, and I can't stress this strongly enough, this is all conjecture. Highly sophisticated and well-researched by some extraordinary minds over the last few centuries, but conjecture nevertheless. So what you're saying is we may find these animals there when we land? Asked Thomas. Partly, yes. Tim turned to face the engineer. But, as I've already briefed the council, there are likely to be huge gaps in our knowledge. We may even find a land bridge still extant between Gondwana and Laurasia, with animals passing to and fro that we didn't even know of. It's less likely, but the fossil record is just too incomplete, too fragmentary for us to be sure of anything. We may also be out on our dating information. I had the same problem when we moved to the States, Woodsy interrupted, nodding sagely. I met this one girl, and she had a... well, never mind, he said, remembering that his father was standing next to him. No matter how sophisticated, Tim emphasized, talking over his friend, our carbon dating technology, we have limited fossils in the record, so any dating can only really be a guide at best. Sometimes even the geology can make accurate dating difficult. Sandstones, for example, can be difficult and notoriously expensive to date. Also, who can say how long a species has lived or will live? All we can do is use the fossil record, correlating as best we can against known systems from our own time. Or at least that's all we could do until now, he added with satisfaction, considering the opportunity before them. Anyway, what I mean is there must be thousands of species we've never found any signs of amongst the larger fauna alone. Do you remember those grab-a-granny nights you used to go to in Wellington, Dad? Interjected Woodsy, nudging his father boisterously as he grinned at Tim. He could teach you a thing or two about carbon dating. Dr. Wood grabbed Mr. Wood roughly around the neck,
tousling his hair.
Ah, Dad,
Woodsy protested in a muffled voice.
you're messing me hair up.
You mean it was meant to look like that? Asked Thomas, grinning. I thought you'd left your hairbrush back in New Zealand, mate. Father released son, and the three men bantered as the teenager checked his do in the reflective glass of the office wall. Perhaps we could get back to the end-of-the-world crisis we're facing, if that's okay with you, Woodsy? Tim asked innocently. My point, I think, was that science has made some astounding discoveries over the last 3 centuries, but we still don't fully understand our planet or the creatures that live upon it in AD 2112. So what chance do we have at accuracy in 99,200,000 BC? We just don't know.
You're a real comfort to me, do you know that?
Chided Woodsy.
So, what do we know? Who are these guys you've pulled up?
Giganotosaurus and Mapusaurus lived, as far as we can tell, in South America more or less contemporaneously, roughly. Well, now, I suppose. Tim called up animations of the beasts running side by side. Giganotosaurus is one of the biggest flesh-eating dinosaurs that have ever been discovered. At around 15 metres long, they may possibly have weighed as much as 8 to 10 tons. About a century ago, people interested in paleontology, or dinosaurs anyway, went through a phase of trying to out-T-Rex the T-Rex, and this guy was a contender. Of course, calmer heads, less interested in sensationalism, thought that the largest of breed were probably fairly comparable in size. As we've only found a few dozens of individuals from even the best-known species, we're far from knowing the full story, especially if they vary as much as, say, dogs or humans. Tyrannosaurus rex seemed to have had a much larger brain, likely providing it with stronger senses and faster reflexes, as well as greater intelligence, or at least instinct. The encephalization quotient, or EQ scale, estimates the size of brain to body mass of T-Rex at around 2.4. To put that in context, our EQ is around 7.5. All right, 0.6 for Woodsy.
Hey!
A dog is around 1.2, although I think Reaver might weigh in at an 8.0. Don't ever think you can outwit him by hiding his rope toy. You will merely look foolish. T-Rex has about the same EQ as a chimpanzee. Now, consider that for a moment. T-Rex also had one of the most extraordinary olfactory systems in the fossil record. Excellent hearing and binocular vision equal at least to that of an eagle. Binocular vision, like our own, is essential for 3-dimensional depth perception. Indeed, it is possible that tyrannosaurs had the best eyesight of any terrestrial animal ever. All those characteristics would have made those animals lethal hunters, or fighters for that matter, although it's doubtful that any predators from any period set out to find the strongest adversaries they could. Chances are that, like lions for example, they would have preyed on the old, the young and the weak. There is certainly a lot of fossil evidence to suggest this, and it makes sense because injury can prove fatal to any carnivore living wild. If you were a tyrannosaur's prey, standing still would not have saved you. All those senses, allied to the possible intelligence of a higher primate, would have been a devastating combination. I don't think throwing him a banana would have helped either. When compared to the carcharodontosaurs, the family Giganotosaurus belongs to, the tyrannosaurs must have been extremely formidable, or will be, 20-odd million years from now and 30 million before we see a Rex. The tyrannosaurs had a much bigger and more general-purpose set of crushing and cutting teeth, with a bite maybe 3 times more powerful than Big G. Its skull was a lot broader and much more solidly built in terms of bone mass. Crucially, and we believe this to be an exclusively tyrannosaur trait, the nasal bones were fused to give the skull immense strength, and perhaps adding to the evidence that they were built to tackle struggling prey that were very much alive. Luckily for us, we won't meet any tyrannosaurs. Tim paused thoughtfully. Actually, that might not be strictly true. Their lineage may well go back further than we first believed, well into the Jurassic. There's evidence suggesting so, although that far back they wouldn't necessarily be obviously recognisable as tyrannosaurs. Thinking about it, their early lineage might also give them wider continental dispersal than we thought too. Only merest hints have been found. They could be in Patagonia. Tim had a faraway look in his eye as he imagined finding new species of hitherto unknown to science tyrannosaurs. He stroked the wispy teenaged whiskers on his jaw contemplatively.
Ahem.
Woodsy barged into his thoughts.
Remember us?
What? Oh, yes. Well, let's just go with we shouldn't see any advanced tyrannosaurs, hopefully. You never know. Dr. Patel might find a way for us to jump forward in time, skipping past the late Cretaceous altogether, Tim added, grinning.
Yeah, right. You'd love to see one really, though, wouldn't you? Asked Woodsy accusingly.
Okay, busted, Tim admitted ruefully, turning back to the screen. Tantalizing evidence has been found to suggest that Maposaurus, also a Carcharodontosaur and slightly smaller cousin to Giganotosaurus, may have been a pack hunter. I may have put the mighty Tyrannosaur on a bit of a pedestal just now, and perhaps deservedly so, but for the love of God, don't underestimate the Carcharodontosaur. They were huge apex predators, dominating the southern hemisphere for many tens of millions of years. When we meet them, they will be more terrifying than anything man has experienced before, at least terrestrially. There is one thing that we should all know about these large theropod animals before we set foot outside the ship. It has to do with the middle toe on each hind foot. Basically, the metacarpal is fused, literally squashed between the two outer metacarpals.
Wow, I'm glad you let me in on that,
Woodsy acknowledged mordantly. Tom Wood, realizing just how important anything relating to a structure built to carry heavy loads might be, waved his son down.
Go on, Tim.
Tim nodded. It's a feature known as the arctometatarsalien condition, and is usually associated with, and you'll see why I think this is important now, fast running. This arrangement removes practically all the movement between the bones. When we run, our metacarpals move within our foot, and this costs us energy. Now this is significant. Many of the predators we will face down there on the planet will likely be fast, yes, but they will also be very efficient runners. Good for the long haul. It is entirely likely that these predatory dinosaurs I've shown you could outrun even the fastest human over the 100 meters. But worse. Far worse. They'll be able to keep up that speed, possibly for a few miles. He looked at Woodsy. Now are you glad I let you in on that? He asked dryly.
I think glad might be a little strong, mate,
Woodsy accepted, paling slightly. Giganotosaurus and Maposaurus may both have been social. Who knows? Maybe we'll find out.
Social?
Asked Woodsy.
I find it hard to imagine them streaming social media or sharing a cup of tea and a bit of a dance.
I don't mean they messaged one another, you numpty, Tim shot back, laughing.
Do you remember the Bookface centenary?
Woodsy rambled on.
When they unveiled that they would henceforth be known as Hollow Face? Because most of their users didn't know what a book was anymore, leading to serious concerns that this made them less social, remember? They were raked in the press with that headline, How the Hollow Will Follow. Well, it's nothing like that, actually. Sorry, forget it. Carry on.
Tim and Thomas exchanged a look and raised an eyebrow apiece before turning back to the computer. When I say social, Tim tried again, I mean they hunted and killed together. It's entirely probable that the younger, quicker animals ran the prey beasts down, while the older, larger members of the group provided the muscle and devastating bite power. There's actually compelling evidence among large flesh-eating dinosaur remains that their leg proportions may even have changed with age. In essence, the lower leg of the younger animals, the bit that would be from the ball of the foot to the heel in a human, could be proportionally longer than in the same breed at a more advanced age. They were also lighter too, of course. When we encounter them, the adolescents may lack some of the awesome power of their elders, but they are likely to be rapid. Tim chattered away excitedly. Picture yourself as a large herbivorous dinosaur being chased by these terrors. They catch up with you, shocking you with bite after bite, bleeding you to bring you down. Then you hear the slower thud, 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 thud. Tim marched the words out with his fists for emphasis. This is the sound of the pack elders running more slowly towards you in order to deliver the colossal death blow. Just imagine the terror of those final moments.
You are way too into this stuff, dude,
mumbled Woodsy, shaking his head. Tim didn't hear his comment, lost as he was in the vision he had conjured. They almost certainly fought with one another too, he continued, as predators from our own time do. Many fossils have been found with teeth marks from their own kind on their faces.
Sounds like a Saturday night out in Wellington,
mused Thomas, thinking of his home in New Zealand.
What's the third animal there?
Woodsy pointed at the screen. Ah, this handsome devil is Irritator challengeri, of the Spinosaurid family, Tim explained.
Irritator? Did he have eczema or something?
Tim gave a look of sufferance. Woodsy grinned. Irritator, Tim continued, was probably an opportunist predator, but with a preference, indeed a specialism, for catching fish. A piscivore, if you will.
Does that mean he couldn't help?
Woodsy tried to ask. No, it doesn't, Tim interrupted him, thrusting a thumb towards his friend. I'm sorry, Tom. I'd better pick up the pace because the children are clearly getting bored. Irritator challengeri was named for Professor Challenger, a fictional character in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's classic novel The Lost World. I think we should rename him Irritator Woodsery. Anyway, as I was saying, this chap was a lot smaller than his cousin Spinosaurus, but was still 8 meters long and over a ton in weight. So in summary, best avoided.
So that's the worst of it?
Asked Thomas hopefully. Yes and no, replied Tim ambiguously. In terms of knocking hell's bells out of your machinery, that should be the worst of it. Apart from the crocodiles, of course. However...
There's always a however,
said Woodsy. Well, yes, said Tim. And in this case, it will be very important to any people we send out on the ground. The small predators are likely to be, in a way, much more dangerous.
How so?
Asked Thomas. Dromaeosaurids have great speed and agility, said Tim simply. Deinonychids and raptors are probably the most widely known, but predominantly lived or will live later in the Cretaceous, he added for clarification. It did not clarify, so he tried again. These animals are famous for their North American origins, but they will almost certainly have had cousins or sports with shared ancestry, at least in the South.
Who doesn't have cousins in the Deep South?
Quipped Woodsy.
Sport.
Not cousins like these, believe me, Tim spoke seriously, as he called up images, statistics, and animations to reinforce his point. These are the ones any people stepping outside the ship will have to watch out for. At least our improved vehicles should offer protection here, though, so it's horses for courses, I suppose. The men watched a simulation showing a pack of late Cretaceous Deinonychids brutally attacking a much larger hadrosaur, an animal 100 times their mass. It was a short animation, but the shiver down the spine remained for a while. It's believed that dromaeosaurids trace their ancestry back all the way to Pangaea, before the breakup, before there was a Gondwana or any other specifically southern continent. If that's correct, then there must surely be raptors where we're going. I know for a fact that Buitreraptor remains were found here. They were found in a rock strata laid down, well, roughly now. If we see one, Buitreraptor will be small but extremely fast, and very likely shorts-soilingly vicious. Tim shook his head. His passion for dinosaurs was all-consuming, but even he looked momentarily afraid. And where there's one raptor, there will almost certainly be more. Still, maybe I will get to discover and name a new species of raptor too, eh? He said, brightening slightly.
Let's hope that's not the last thing you do. And what do you mean, too? Asked Woodsy.
Oh, I was just thinking about Never mind. There is some good news, though, Tim added cheerfully, trying to dispel the atmosphere. Or one could say, atmosphere. There should be plenty of smaller herbivores which will provide us with meat. Animals like Hypsilophodontids, young hadrosaurids known as duck-billed dinosaurs, and the omnipresent iguanodonts. These must have been among the most successful families in the later Mesozoic, and although there's not an exhaustive record of their presence in South America, I wouldn't be surprised if we find them in good numbers. Of course, they're still likely to be aggressive when threatened, and most will be able to easily outrun us on foot too, or run us down depending on how annoyed they are. There will be very few easy meals for us when we land, I'm afraid.
But plenty of fast food, Woodsy could not resist.
Thomas exhaled deeply, trying not to imagine his son being caught by these nightmares.
Did you mention crocodiles as well? He asked.
Yes, replied Tim seriously. In this time they are diverse and, in some cases, huge. Well over twice the length and many times the size of the largest saltwater crocodile. I would suggest the drivers of your altered vehicles stay away from any river shores, beds or deltas.
Thomas nodded slowly, wearing a look of concern. Thanks, Tim. At least that gives me some idea of what we're up against. I think I'd better get back to adapting this plant and equipment, he said. I need a nice maths puzzle to take my mind off these clips you've shown me, or I won't sleep tonight. Maybe you'd like to see what we're working on?
Yeah, definitely, Tim replied eagerly.
Right,
said Thomas, breaking the link between his wall monitor and Tim's comm.
Take a look at these technical schematics. This is one of the people carriers we have on board. Now, I'm thinking that if we keep the structural rigidity of the cabin, but lighten where possible, we should be able to make them less lumbering.
Engineering puzzles eased Thomas's mind of real-world concerns, always had. Whenever the walls were closing in, he could always disappear into a realm of equations, where all was beauty and balance. He smiled slightly without realizing, as he drew Tim into his world.
Obviously this will be a quick fix, and we'll probably need to develop new vehicles over time, but it's a start. We're going to need the diggers, lorries and personnel carriers first. So, we've a lot to do.
Has a strategy been devised for when we land, then? Asked Tim.
Thomas nodded. You'll hear more about it at the council meeting tomorrow, but in a nutshell, this is the plan.
Later that evening, Tim sat alone in the bar waiting for Woodsy and Hank to show. He had thoroughly enjoyed his afternoon spent with Thomas Wood, and now passed the time refamiliarizing himself with the suspected climatic conditions for the late Albian stage of the Cretaceous period. He had collected so much information throughout his childhood that he felt sure he could build an advanced picture of the world they would soon call home, hopefully before they had to face it for real. Digging a little deeper, he was able to localize the data for Patagonia specifically. Tim felt sure he had read somewhere that geological and paleontological evidence suggested temperate conditions and, as far as 22nd century understanding was concerned, he seemed to be on the money. He read on. They would likely encounter wide prairies covered with ferns, cycads, and myriad scrub. Also, there would be broad forests in what would one day be Argentina. They should also find deciduous and even early flowering plant life. If he understood correctly, Lieutenant Singh had chosen a landing zone well to the south, so they would probably be close to where the South Andean Mountains would one day stand, as the landmass narrowed towards the southern tip. This latitude may be slightly warmer than 22nd century Patagonia, but should nonetheless provide fairly comfortable living conditions. The continent would become more tropical the further north you travelled towards the equator, as it would in the future. Tim sat back, the beginnings of a contented smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The Andes. A little piece of home. Maybe the world they raced towards would not be so alien as many feared. Of course, the longest mountain range on the earth in which Tim had grown up would not be as mankind had known it. He found an article in which a prominent geologist postulated that the Andean Mountains began to form in the late Triassic period, fairly early in the Mesozoic era, and a time of extraordinary tectonic movement, roughly 200 million years before man. Although it was widely held that the Andes of the modern era began to rise around 40 million years before man, during the Eocene epoch of the Paleogene period, there had been several pre-Andean orogenies throughout the Mesozoic and Cenozoic eras. Despite his fascination, it occurred to Tim that he was going to have to break this down and simplify for his crash course in Cretaceous living. The people attending would not need, and if he was honest, probably would not want to know about uplifting, folding, and faulting rock formations sliding over the ancient Amazonian craton. Indeed,
If he even spoke that sentence aloud in the presence of Woodsy, his life wouldn't be worth living. So he searched for an appropriate summary and found 3 key pieces of information which he thought people would wish to know. Firstly, geologists believed that during the Cretaceous, the pre-Andean deformations and convergences began to take on a similar form and composition to the Andean mountains everyone would be familiar with. Note 3. Almost 100 million years in the future, the word origin would be coined to describe the crumpling of a continental plate, an action which pushes up a mountain range, sometimes more than one range. Note 4. A craton is a large, stable block of the Earth's crust. Often surviving the merging and rifting of continents intact, they are generally found within a continent's interior. Almost 100 million years ago, these would simply be understood as the best places to stand. Secondly, the rock should contain iron ore in vast quantities. That might come in handy if we need to build anything, Tim thought. Thirdly, and most worryingly, the place in which they were about to land was a region of near constant instability, or at least it suffered many phases of instability.
Fantastic,
he muttered under his breath.
That means earthquakes and, joy of joys, volcanoes. Great!
He sighed, thinking,
I hope you know what you're doing, Lieutenant Singh. I'm really not sure we should be landing here.
Tim knew that mountain ranges were always in motion, despite appearances. But to land in a known subduction zone within a landscape populated by dinosaurs, with no support, seemed foolhardy, to put it mildly.
And all this just to save fuel? But what do I know? I'm just a kid, right?
He rhetoricized anxiously. However, simply being able to pin a contemporary name on this ancient landscape lifted Tim's spirits a little. He sensed the permanent connection, the through line and proof of belonging with a world which in turn belonged to every creature born to it. Home, but there would be differences. Leaving aside any possible cataclysmic events which might overtake them, there would be other environmental distractions too, some of them potentially huge and yet easily taken for granted. A related article opened in a new window on Tim's screen. It discussed coprolites discovered in the early 21st century which were found to contain grass minerals dating from the late Cretaceous. Further evidence of grass had been revealed in Egypt, going back perhaps another 20 million years still. However, from the unique viewpoint of Tim and his fellow castaways, grass would probably not be widespread globally for millions of years to come. He looked up from his notes, trying to imagine a world without grass. Elements of the robust Poaceae plant family were among the few that still thrived unassisted in the polluted 22nd century. Yet it was entirely likely that there would be none at all where they were heading. He would be willing to bet that this ancient world would be stuffed full of other oddities too, not to mention many new animals, all waiting to be discovered by the New World's crew. He accepted that his might be a lonely perspective, but he really couldn't wait to find out, despite his misgivings about Patagonia. If you had to be all alone in the universe, this really was the only way to travel. He linked into the ship's chrono for a moment. 20:04 hours. His mum would be in her meeting on the bridge by now. She had really put in some hours with Dr. Wright, attempting to wring further evidence from the bomb sites. The buzz about ships suggested that one of the engineers was being held for questioning. Everyone was gossiping about it. Tim had been told in confidence that both sites were clean, suspiciously clean. So naturally, the rumour mill was in full turn, producing tales to plug any inconvenient gaps in the evidence. He looked around expectantly.
Talking of gossips, he thought, Woodsy and Hank should be here any minute.
No sign yet. Part of him was glad as he returned to his notes, his mind once more flying with giant pterosaurs over the pre-Andean mountains, his eyes half closed in contented rapture.
I could give the pre-Andes a name, he thought suddenly. Something a little more imaginative than pre, perhaps.
This led to mulling and pondering, even musing,
Andes Mountains. Andes. 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 Who the hell is Andy? No. Who was before Andy? That's the question. Peter? Yes, Peter. St. Peter was the older brother of Andrew, I think. I'd better look it up. Ah, here we go. Yes, that's it. Roll fanfare.
I'll call them the Peaties.
Now that's a good day's work. And did I get all smug about it? Never fear. I'm sure to be in the history books, or at least the pre-history books for that one. He pondered some more. Pre-history books. There's something wrong with that phrase, I think. Never mind. The details can be worked out later.
All I really need to do now is to be the first to set foot on the Peaties when we land, and stick some kind of a flag in the ground with Tim's ear on it.
Dinosaur, written by Stephen Llewelyn and performed by Chris Barrie. New installments uploaded each week. Subscribe for more. Visit the link in the description for free New World companion stories, available for download as ebooks.